December 20th, 1941, Shingmun Hill, Kowloon, British colony of Hong Kong. The air smells of three things that do not belong together, but are now inseparable in the collective memory of the century. The cloying sweetness of tropical vegetation crushed under boots, the sourness of old sweat impregnated in wet wool, and the metallic tang of fresh blood still evaporating in fine threads in the humid heat of dawn. Canadian Sergeant Thomas Arthur Mitchell, 27 years old, Royal Rifles of Canada, is lying face down on the soaked slope of a hastily dug shallow trench, his face pressed against the warm mud that the mosquitoes ignore, but bullets do not. His hands, calloused from years as a Quebec lumberjack, grip the Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle too tightly, knuckles white, jaw locked to the point of pain, and eyes wide not from heroism, but from a desperate attempt to register every movement in the thick mist rising from the valley. Behind him, scattered in makeshift foxholes, are 183 men whom the Imperial Japanese Army listed in intelligence reports as Canadian auxiliary troops, disciplined but not aggressive. Several officers in Tokyo even repeated at the sake table that these King's Marines were too polite, too civilized, too polite to fight, too gentle to sustain a defense until the last cartridge. This phrase crosses Mitchell's brain now like a splinter as he listens down below to the unmistakable sound of light metal hitting metal, bayonets being fixed, mixed with the rustling of 1,000 feet climbing the ravine as if the forest itself had decided to advance. For the past 3 weeks, he has seen numbers become crushed people. More than 1,200 Canadians are already dead, wounded, or missing in street fighting in Sham Shui Po, Wong Nai Chung, and the surrounding hills, names of neighborhoods that until November meant only dots on a map, and now equal faceless friends, statistics that do not round up because every unit lost is a face that haunts him in the few minutes of sleep. He fought in 3 different positions, lost nearly half his platoon defending a bridge at the gin drinkers line, where he learned the hard way that Japanese grenades do not sound like British ones, and that the silence after the blast is deadlier than the noise. But now something is different. This time there is no retreat line, there are no ships waiting in the bay. In 3 hours and 42 minutes, if the command schedule holds, the Japanese expect to have completely swept this sector, and optimistic reports in Tokyo will speak of an exemplary cleanup, while in practice, more than 1,200 Allied men will vanish into the tangle of ravines, sewers, tunnels, and burning buildings, with no identifiable body, no grave, just names crossed off lists. The Japanese officers who laughed the night before in a well-lit shelter, commenting that these Canadians say, "Sir, even to death," have no idea that the men climbing the ravine now will encounter something their doctrine did not measure, a resistance that looks nothing like poster heroism but like organized despair. The obvious advantage lies entirely with the enemy. They have numerical superiority of nearly 5 to 1 in this sector, total control of the airspace, and field artillery lined up in batteries that have already proven, in Nanjing and Singapore, that they know how to crush urban centers as if they were rice paper houses. They have a reputation for fighting without taking prisoners, they have the jungle on their side, and a chain of command that treats its own infantry as disposable ammunition. But what Thomas Arthur Mitchell and his 183 men bring to this slope is something the Japanese reports failed to internalize, a toxic combination of shame, accumulated rage from weeks of retreat, and the naked realization that no one is coming for them. And it is precisely this emotional mathematics, and not any modern gadget, that will ensure that when the sun sets over Hong Kong, Japanese officers will count bodies, cross-reference numbers, and realize with a cold epistemological delay that more than 1,200 soldiers they believed they had cornered simply disappeared into the mist, the fire, and the mud, leaving behind only empty craters, twisted weapons, and the kind of silence that, decades later, still wakes Canadian veterans in the middle of the night. To understand why the disappearance of 1,200 men represented such a psychological shock to the Japanese 38th Division, you have to go back to 1937. The Imperial Japanese military philosophy was not merely tactical, it was spiritual, codified in the Senjin-kun, the field service code. It was a doctrine born in the blood of the Russo-Japanese War and perfected in the rape of Nanjing. Its central theorist, General Sadao Araki, preached the supremacy of the Seishin spirit over material matter. The Japanese soldier was taught that surrender was not just a military failure, but a biological stain on the family's honor that could span generations. This created a dangerous assumption that the enemy, lacking this spiritual code, would collapse psychologically when faced with the inevitability of defeat. They trusted their Type 38 Arisaka rifles, long and unwieldy but accurate, and their knee mortars, the Type 89 grenade dischargers, which could drop explosives with terrifying precision into enemy trenches. They trusted their Type 95 Hago tanks, light and fast, which had sliced through British defences in Malaya like knives through butter. But above all, they trusted their intelligence. The Kempe Tai, the military police, knew exactly how many Canadians had landed. They knew about the Sea Force, the 2 battalions sent by Ottawa as a political gesture, more than a military one. They knew the Canadians had no heavy artillery, no anti-tank guns, and no air support. They knew the Royal Rifles were from Quebec and the Winnipeg Grenadiers from Manitoba, units that had performed garrison duties in Newfoundland and Jamaica, but had never fired a shot in anger. This was not ignorance. The Japanese possessed specific intelligence. Spies in the chaotic port of Hong Kong had counted the crates of ammunition being unloaded. They knew the Canadians were using outdated transport trucks and that their mortars lacked sights. What they did not grasp, what they could not internalize until December 20th, was the adaptability of men who have nothing left to lose. The Japanese preparation was meticulous for a conventional battle against a demoralized colonial garrison. They brought bridging equipment for the ravines. They stockpiled thousands of rounds of artillery for a methodical bombardment, but they prepared for the wrong enemy. They prepared for British regulars who fought by the book. They did not prepare for lumberjacks and prairie farmers who, stripped of officers and communication, reverted to a primal, almost tribal form of warfare. The irony of the Japanese preparation is that they brought enough firepower to level a city, but not enough flexibility to clear a single hill held by men who refused to read the script of their own defeat. Thomas Arthur Mitchell was born in a logging camp near Chicoutimi. He didn't learn to shoot at a range. He learned shooting wolves that threatened the horses in winter. His father was a foreman who lost an arm to a buzzsaw and taught Thomas that pain was just information, not an excuse to stop working. He joined the army not for king and country, but because the lumber camps were closing and 3 meals a day sounded like luxury. His journey to Hong Kong was a blur of seasickness and boredom, ending in a city that smelled of incense and open sewers, a place so alien it might as well have been Mars. He wrote to his sister Marie, "The mountains here are steep, but the trees are wrong. They don't smell like pine." He didn't know it was the last letter she would receive for 4 years. He didn't know that in the coming hours he would kill a man with an entrenching tool because his rifle jammed. He didn't know that the polite Canadian within him was about to be buried under layers of necessary savagery. Just the innovation the Japanese faced wasn't technological. It was tactical improvisation born of scarcity. The Canadians had no grenades left. They made Molotov cocktails from whiskey bottles found in abandoned officers' clubs. No trip flares. They tied empty tin cans to fishing lines across the trails. The Japanese doctrine relied on speed and shock, the banzai charge. It worked against terrified conscripts. But against Mitchell and his men, dug into the root systems of banyan trees, it was suicide. The Japanese would scream "Banzai" to terrorize. The Canadians would stay silent until the enemy was 5 meters away. This silence was the weapon. It wasn't discipline. It was the terrifying patience of hunters. At Wong Nai Chung Gap, the vital pass that split the island's defense, the collision of these two worlds reached its zenith. The Japanese attacked with the precision of a metronome. Artillery barrage at Aung 6 Wareo, infantry advance at Aung 6:15. But the Canadians didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They dissolved into the landscape. A Japanese platoon would secure a building only to find grenades dropping through the floorboards from the attic. They would clear a bunker, only to be shot from behind by men who had let them pass. Brigadier John Lawson, commanding the West Brigade, found his headquarters surrounded. Instead of surrendering, he radioed his final message, going outside to fight it out. He walked out into a storm of machine gun fire with a pistol in each hand, an act of defiance that confused the Japanese commanders as much as it killed them. They couldn't categorize it. Was it Bushido? No, these were barbarians. Then why did they die like samurai? The climax at Shingmun was not a single battle, but a series of vicious, intimate murders. The Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, the Woodpecker, began to disassemble the Canadian trench line. Trees splintered, bodies came apart. Mitchell saw Private Shorty Evans, a kid from Winnipeg who played the harmonica, try to catch a grenade to throw it back. It detonated in his hand. There was no scream, just a pink mist and Evans staring at a stump where his future used to be. Mitchell didn't vomit. He didn't cry. He aimed his Lee Enfield. The bolt action was smooth, a mechanical comfort in a world gone mad. He shot the Japanese officer waving a sword. He shot the machine gunner. He shot the loader. He stopped shooting people and started shooting shapes. The Japanese kept coming, wave after human wave, stepping over their own dead with a terrifying indifference. The ammunition ran low. "Fix bayonets," the order was whispered, not shouted. The click of steel on steel was the sound of the end. When the Japanese finally overran the position at 10 a.m., they found the trenches empty of living souls. They found bodies, yes, but not enough. Where were the rest? Where were the 1,200 men? They searched the ravines. They burned the scrub. Nothing. The Canadians hadn't vanished into thin air. They had vanished into the earth, into the complex network of storm drains and forgotten tunnels, or simply merged with the piles of civilian dead in the chaos of the fall of Hong Kong. They became ghosts before they were even dead. The Japanese victory was absolute on paper, but hollow in reality. They held the ground, but they had not broken the enemy's spirit. They had merely displaced it. The polite Canadians had not fought like gentlemen. They had fought like cornered rats, and in doing so, they had scarred the psyche of the 38th Division. The bodies were never found, because there were no bodies left to find in the way a civilized army understands, only fragments of men mixed with the mud of a colony that had ceased to exist. And for Thomas Mitchell, now bleeding from 3 wounds, hiding in a culvert with rats gnawing at his boots, the war was no longer about winning. It was about refusing to give them the satisfaction of his death. He would survive the camps. He would survive the starvation. But he would never leave Shingmun Hill. Part of him would remain there forever, face down in the mud, listening to the sound of bayonets being fixed in the mist. By the time the white flag finally appeared over the governor's residence on December 25th, the day that would be remembered as Black Christmas, the shooting on Shingmun Hill had already stopped, replaced first by the wet thud of bayonets doing tidying up work, and then by an even more disturbing silence as the surviving Canadians were herded at rifle point down toward makeshift collection points, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and tropical mud, their eyes ringed in grey, as if someone had already drawn the first outlines of their future ghosts. In the ruined corridors of Wong Nai Chung Gap, Japanese staff officers walked with clipboards through air that still stank of cordite and burned wood, counting bodies by flashlight in rooms where wallpaper hung in blackened curls and ceiling fans had fused into twisted metal flowers, and somewhere between the columns of kanji and the smears of blood on the paper, they realized that the numbers did not add up. The 38th Division's reports spoke confidently of encircled enemy strength, approximately 1,200 Canadians and other Allied troops in the northern sectors, but the corpses on the ground, even allowing for those reduced to unrecognizable fragments, fell hundreds short, as if entire platoons had been erased from the topography rather than killed upon it. The missing men were not miracles. They were the byproduct of chaos. Some lay crushed under collapsed masonry that would not be cleared for months. Some had been dragged into storm drains and culverts where rising water and heat turned them into anonymous sludge. And many of those flagged in Japanese logs as vanished were in fact very much alive, starting a second, slower war behind the wire of Sham Shui Po and North Point prison camps, where dysentery, beriberi, and deliberate starvation would kill them with a patience that rifle fire never had. But to the officers in the divisional bunker on that first night of victory, poring over casualty tables while the city outside burned, the discrepancy felt like an epistemological insult, a reminder that even in triumph their picture of the battlefield had been fatally incomplete. Decades later, when a Canadian historian opened a declassified bundle of Japanese war diaries in a climate-controlled archive in Tokyo and found, between neat lines of brushstroke characters, a terse note from a regimental adjutant wondering why the Canadian Marines had resisted with unexpected ferocity and how so many of them had disappeared without leaving recoverable remains, Thomas Arthur Mitchell was an old man in Quebec who woke 3 times a week drenched in sweat because in his dreams he was still face down on that hill, listening to bayonets being fixed in the mist, and the historian, tracing with a finger the faint water stain where some long-dead officer's teacup had rested on the page, understood with a cold, delayed clarity that the real absence recorded there was not only the 1,200 bodies the Japanese never found, but the part of each survivor that never walked out of Hong Kong at all. For the survivors of Xingmun and Wang Naicheng, the silence of the surrender on Christmas Day 1941 was not an end, but a transition into a slower, more bureaucratic form of asphyxiation, a descent into a world where time was no longer measured in hours or minutes, but in calories and grams of rice, and where the politeness that the Japanese officers had so mockingly ascribed to them was stripped away layer by layer until all that remained was a raw, vibrating core of biological refusal to die. The journey did not stop at the barbed wire of North Point or Sham Shui-Po, those disease-ridden holding pens where dysentery moved through the barracks faster than any rumor, turning strong men into skeletal husks who wept from the shame of their own incontinence, but continued into the bowels of unmarked transport ships, like the Lisbon Maru, floating coffins of rusted iron where men were packed so tightly into the holds that they had to sleep standing up in a slurry of seawater, urine, and the vomit of the dying. Gasping for air that grew heavier with carbon dioxide with every hour, the hatches remained battened down against the American submarines prowling the South China Sea. Thomas Arthur Mitchell, the lumberjack who had learned to shoot wolves in Quebec, found himself 3,000 miles north in the freezing labor camps of Niigata, Japan, where the tropical rot of Hong Kong was replaced by a cold that shattered teeth and turned fingers into black, unfeeling claws, forced to haul coal in a shipyard for the very empire that had erased his regiment, his body consuming its own muscle mass until he weighed less than 90 pounds, and his vision blurred from the agonizing neuropathy known as electric feet, a sensation described by survivors not as pain but as walking on white-hot wires barefoot, a constant neurological screaming that denied them even the sanctuary of sleep. The irony of the polite Canadian soldier reached its grim zenith here in the shadow of the Japanese Alps, because the men who survived Niigata and Omine were not the gentle colonial boys the intelligence reports had described. They had become feral adapters, men who learned to steal food with sleight-of-hand magic, under the eyes of guards who would behead them for a potato, men who learned to sabotage machinery with a single grain of sand in a bearing, men who maintained a secret, vicious discipline that had nothing to do with saluting officers and everything to do with keeping the man next to you from giving up and walking into the electric fence. When the liberation finally came in 1945, dropping from the sky not with a bang, but with the sudden, confused silence of guards disappearing into the hills after the flash over Hiroshima, Mitchell and the surviving ghosts of Sea-Force did not cheer. They simply sat down in the coal dust and wept, not from joy, but from the crushing exhaustion of holding up the weight of their own survival for 1,375 days. They returned to a Canada that did not know how to look at them, a country celebrating the victory in Europe, the liberation of Holland, the clean narrative of defeating Nazis, while these walking skeletons from the East brought with them a silence that was uncomfortable and jagged, a story of defeat and degradation that didn't fit the newsreels, so they buried it. Mitchell went back to the woods of Quebec, married a woman who learned never to touch his shoulder to wake him, and spent 40 years staring at the trees that finally smelled right. But the story wasn't over. It was merely waiting for the archaeology of the future to dig it up. In 2014, during the renovation of a damp basement in a suburb of Tokyo, a construction crew found a rusted tin box containing the personal diary of a Lieutenant Tanaka, a junior intelligence officer attached to the 38th Division in Hong Kong, and on page 58, dated December 21, 1941, the entry read, "We continue to search the ravines for the enemy main force. It is unsettling. We killed many, but the numbers do not match the resistance. It is as if we fought spirits who wore British uniforms, but fought with the desperation of demons. I fear we have killed their bodies but missed their hate." At almost the exact same time, across the ocean in a dusty attic in Chicoutimi, Mitchell's granddaughter found his own small, water-stained notebook hidden inside a false bottom of his old tool chest, and on the last page, scribbled in pencil so faint it was almost invisible, was the answer to Tanaka's fear, written not with politeness, but with the final, brutal clarity of a man who has seen the bottom of the world. They think they beat us because they took the hill. They don't know that we are taking the rest of the war with us in our heads. We aren't soldiers anymore. We are the thing that waits in the dark for them to close their eyes. The two diaries, separated by an ocean and 70 years of silence, finally closed the loop on the mystery of the vanishing men. The 1,200 troops hadn't just disappeared into the mud of Hong Kong. They had been transmuted by the alchemy of trauma into a memory so heavy, so dense and so dark that it outlived the empire that tried to crush them, leaving behind a legacy that was not about victory or defeat, but about the terrifying endurance of the human spirit when it is stripped of everything except the refusal to be polite to the monster standing at the door. For decades after Black Christmas, the official story of Hong Kong in Canada was a footnote, a brief mention between the triumphs of Dieppe's lessons learned and Normandy's eventual success, a defeat too painful and too complicated to fit into parades and classroom posters, and so the men of Seaforce went home and learned to make their own silence into armor. In Legion halls and logging camps, in prairie bars and quiet factory lunchrooms, they developed a code more rigid than any army regulation. You did not talk about bayonets in the mist. You did not talk about men who had shrunk into shadows in prison huts. You did not talk about how almost 2,000 Canadians had been sent to a fortress that would not hold, and how more than 500 never came back from the hills and the camps, except in the short, strangled phrases that slipped out in the dark when a wife or child pretended to be asleep and listened anyway. By the time the archives began to open and younger historians started tracing the thin, faded lines of ink in war diaries on both sides of the Pacific, many of the men who could have filled in the gaps were already in unmarked ground, their stories locked behind skulls that no one had ever dared tap. It was in those files, Canadian signals reports, Japanese unit logs, handwritten lists of prisoners loaded onto hell ships, that the shape of the vanishing finally became clear. 1,200 wasn't a ghost number. It was the sum of a broken reinforcement plan, a jungle battlefield no one had properly mapped, and a prison system designed not to record individual suffering, but to process bodies until they stopped moving. Each smudged name in those lists pushed back against the lazy myth that the Canadians had been too polite to fight, replacing it with a harder reality. They had fought until the machinery of an empire ground them down, and even then, many had simply slipped beyond the reach of any ledger that tried to balance the cost. Mainbo. In the late 20th century, as PTSD finally acquired a name that wasn't shell shock or nerves, the ghosts of Hong Kong began to seep into public view, not through speeches by generals, but through interviews with men whose hands still shook when they smelled burning rice. Documentaries and official histories started to acknowledge that the battle had been a political gesture, paid for in human bone, that the decision to send undertrained units halfway around the world without armor or air support had been less a strategy than a gamble with other people's lives. Memorials went up, bronze figures in Ottawa, plaques in Winnipeg and Quebec City, carefully tended stones in Hong Kong itself, and on those cold surfaces the names of the disappeared were carved as if to anchor them in a world that had once been so eager to lose track of them. For the families, though, the reckoning was always more intimate and less complete. Our granddaughter in Chicoutimi, reading Thomas Arthur Mitchell's notebook, could not reconcile the gentleman who carved toys from scrap wood with the line in his diary, where he admitted that, in the worst nights of Niigata, he had hoped a guard's rifle would slip and end it. A son in Winnipeg, looking at his father's POW tag, understood for the first time why that man had flinched every time a door slammed, why he had insisted on always keeping extra bread in the house just in case, and why he had never once complained when Christmas dinners were burned, because there were Christmases when food of any kind had been a rumor rather than a fact. These private discoveries did not change the outcome of the war, but they reweighted its ledger, shifting some of the burden of memory from the abstract language of campaigns and divisions back onto the fragile, stubborn bodies that had carried it in the first place. In the end, the Japanese officers who once joked that Canadian Marines were too courteous for real war were long dead, their words surviving only as marginal notes in diaries that now sit behind glass, studied by strangers who know how the story turned out and cannot change a frame of it. What outlived them was not the neat symmetry of their victory parade in Hong Kong, but the asymmetrical, unfinished legacy of the men they misjudged, the half-healed scars on the legs of old prisoners, the empty chairs at family tables, the midnight jolts awake when a veteran in his 80s still smelled coal dust or tropical rot, and for a heartbeat was back on Shing Mun Hill, counting the seconds until the next attack. In that sense, the 1,200 who vanished never really left the field at all. They remained embedded in the nervous systems and family stories of a country that took too long to see them, but that can no longer, honestly, pretend they were ever too polite to fight. Today, if you hike the steep, humid trails of the Wilson or Hong Kong Parkview, pushing through the same tangled undergrowth that once concealed Japanese snipers and desperate Canadian platoons, the only sounds you are likely to hear are the rhythmic breathing of joggers, the chirping of cicadas, and the distant, low-frequency hum of one of the world's most vertical cities, a neon and glass metropolis built directly on top of the bone meal of 1941. It is a landscape that has aggressively paved over its own trauma, where luxury apartment complexes now sit on the exact coordinates where the Winnipeg Grenadiers made their last stands, and where shopping malls cool their air with electricity generated near the spots where prisoners of war once died of malnutrition in the sweltering heat. But the erasure is never total, because the geology of Hong Kong, much like the memory of the men who fought there, has a way of pushing the past back to the surface. Every rainy season, when the typhoons strip away the topsoil on the ridges of Wong Nai Chung Gap, hikers and construction crews still find them. Rusted Lee-Enfield bolt mechanisms fused by oxidation into useless lumps of iron, brass casings from Japanese Arisaka rifles turned green by 70 years of damp rot, and occasionally, the small unrecognizable fragments of men who were marked as missing on a ledger in Ottawa 3 generations ago. These artifacts are not just refuse, they are the physical residue of the polite lie, sharp and tetanus-laced reminders that the civility of the British Empire and the spiritual superiority of the Japanese Empire were both smashed to pieces here by the raw, industrial reality of slaughter. The Japanese officers who laughed are dust. The Canadian lumberjacks and prairie boys who vanished are soil. The empire that sent them is a history book footnote. What remains is the irony that hangs over the skyscrapers of Central District like the morning smog. The modern, prosperous peace of this city was paid for by men who were told their sacrifice would be a holding action, a strategic delay, a gesture. Thomas Arthur Mitchell, in his final years, sitting on his porch in Chicoutimi, stopped trying to explain the smell of the jungle to people who only saw it on postcards. He understood that some wars don't end with a treaty, they just move underground, waiting for a shovel or a memory to disturb them. The 1200 didn't vanish into thin air. They were woven into the root systems of the banyan trees, becoming the silent, structural integrity of a history that tries very hard to forget them, proving in the end that while you can kill a man, and you can lose his body, and you can even mock his manners, you can never ever truly scrub the stain of his final, desperate refusal to disappear from the hill where he decided that being polite was no longer an option.